As you're aware, the United States has today announced a new tariff regime which increases tariffs on New Zealand goods entering the US from 10 to 15%. This is a disappointing development. New Zealand and the US have a deep and long-standing friendship, and US exporters already face much lower tariffs exporting to New Zealand than goods going the other way. Minister McClay and officials have taken every opportunity to point out that to their US counterparts since President Trump's first tariff announcement in April. However, it appears New Zealand has been impacted by a very blunt formula which does not take account of the low tariffs we impose on US products. Instead, the blunt formula simply says that countries which export more to the US than they import will face higher tariff rates. Currently, New Zealand does export slightly more to the US than it imports, although the reverse has also been the case at several points in recent years. So we will be talking to our friends in the United States about that. Today, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been meeting with the US Embassy representative on this matter, and our Washington Embassy will also be meeting with its counterparts, and ministers will give consideration to what engagements we can usefully make. On the positive side, we do need to remember the broader context here, which is that our exporters continue to do well. New Zealand exports rose 11.4% in the 12 months to June, and exports to the US increased 6.3% over that period. Commodity prices have also been at near record highs for much of the year. Until now, the experience of many businesses affected by US tariffs has been that they've been able to pass on the additional tariff costs, or at least some of those costs, to buyers. We will have to see what the impact of this latest development is, but I expect that some of those companies will probably now redouble their efforts to develop and explore other markets. The government, for our part, will continue our work to support those exporters with good information. We will continue our work to open up new markets around the world and to pursue good trade into those countries with whom we already have free trade arrangements, and we will continue to represent New Zealand's case for a better deal with the US. I will now hand over to Todd to say a few words about how we're responding to this development, and then we'll take questions.
Well, Nicola, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcement today is not surprising. As we've said over the last short period of time, there have been signals out of the US that there was likely to be a change, that New Zealand could be impacted by that. As Nicola has said, it's just a form that's been used that says a list of countries that sell more to the US than they buy from the US have had 15% or in some cases higher placed upon them. Our exporters to date have weathered the increase of 10% tariffs extremely well. In talking to many of them, the larger ones, as Nicola has said, they've either been able to pass the cost on and absorb it, or have made choices themselves about other markets that give them greater certainty, or they might get a better return. At 15%, an additional 5% makes that more challenging for them, but there is still confidence in their ability in that market to provide the high quality goods that New Zealand produces. The trade deficit that we have, or the surplus against against the US, is quite modest compared to the size of the US economy, around $500 million US, based on 9 billion New Zealand dollars worth of exports. You will note or will have seen that Australia sits at 10% and New Zealand is now at 15%. That's because Australia actually imports more from the US than they sell them. In as far as exports are concerned, though, this is not the first time we've faced additional competition in that market from others in Australia. Of course, before President Trump came to office, Australia had a trade agreement where predominantly they were at 0% tariff rate for the many things that we compete against. When he made his announcements of the 10% a short while ago, Australia went to the 10%, the same as us, and now we're seeing a short space in that. We have engaged both here in New Zealand today with the US Embassy. Our officials in Washington have been keeping in constant contact with their counterparts, and the United States Trade Representative Office. I have asked, they put in a formal request on our behalf for me to have a call with Ambassador Greer, and I've also sent a message to him requesting that, so that we can talk about the difference of their approach, the harm that we think it will do not only to trade but also to consumers in the US, and to seek the ability to talk about how we can reduce this additional 5% to support New Zealand exporters. With that in mind, happy to take questions.
Can you just spell out that harm? What damage could be done to New Zealand exports?
Well, ultimately, I think for a number of the products we export, we are very competitive, and our exporters remain nimble, but there will be some where it becomes harder to compete in that market. So if we take wine as an example, it's an important market for wine. The imposition of 10% has been challenging for them, except where most other countries, all other countries, have faced the same. With the European Union, who they compete against, imported wine, we sit at the same tariff rate. In the case of Australia, there will be a 5% difference. So in essence, at 10%, much of that has been able to absorb. For some of our exporters, an additional 5% starts to become material, but we're reaching out to talk to them to work through exactly what that looks like. The announcement by President Trump that has been published is quite complex, and we have our officials going through it now. There seems to be a number of areas where there could be exemptions or different treatment, but we're working through that very quickly.
And exporters will ultimately manage this in different ways. For some, they'll reduce their margin, which will reduce their return. For others, they'll increase their prices, and some may choose to sell their goods in other markets around the world. So it will take time for them to assess what the best course for them is. We will make the resources of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, fully available to them so that they can make choices that are as good as possible for New Zealand.
Did this 5% increase blindside you, Minister?
No, it didn't blindside us. I think there's been signals for the last few weeks through the media, and President Trump saying that there would be changes. We've been engaging and talking about the balance of trade, how US exporters into New Zealand face on average a 0.8% tariff rate. But I think what we've seen here is just a blunt decision that anybody that sells more to the US than they buy will face higher tariff rates.
How confident are you that you can have this?
Minister, did you misspeak when you said that we'd be no worse off than anyone else? We're worse off than Australia now.
Well, we're marginally worse off than Australia. So I didn't misspeak, but I think what I was referring to is the information that has been coming to us through the media. And so, we have an announcement today. We haven't received a letter. We may well do so. But no, ultimately, though, if you look at New Zealand exporters in that market, they've continued to do well, and we'll be working with them to work out some of these issues.
How confident are you?
Was it a mistake not to seek negotiations with the Trump administration on this?
Well, no, you might recall that I met with my counterpart in Korea some months ago. We talked about that, and one of the clear indications he gave, or signals he gave, was that there are countries that face much higher tariff rates than New Zealand that they were negotiating with, and it's a challenge of, as he said at the time, bandwidth. But there are some other countries that have been negotiating that are in exactly the same position as New Zealand today, but we will be reaching out to make our case to them.
And I think, Thomas, what's really clear is that a blunt formula was applied here in which we export more to the US than we import, and no amount of talking would have changed that fact. It's also the case that some countries, including Japan and Korea, who have negotiated extensively, have still been hit with those rates. So this is a situation where the US has made their own decision. We will continue to advance New Zealand's interests and argue what we believe is a very strong case.
You both said
the strategy failed. You shouldn't have kept your head down. That the sort of the not negotiating, the keeping quiet, has ultimately not proven right.
Well, I think when you're opposition, all you can do is be political, but I would reject that very strongly. For instance, I've also seen them say that higher tariff rates in the US is going to put up the price for New Zealand consumers. I'm not sure about that either. But ultimately, there has been a lot of engagement. We've seen Minister Peters go up to the US. I've had 3 meetings, 2 in person, 1 in a Zoom with my counterpart, and our officials have been working with the US, very, very closely. So ultimately, a decision is made. There are a group of countries where the tariff rate will go up, and as with at least 40 other countries around the world, we're looking to engage further.
How confident are you that you're actually going to be able to get a reversal of this decision to get it back down to at least 10%?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of countries that have had deep negotiations with the US that are also facing 10%, but we'll be making the case for New Zealand.
How confident?
How you found out? How do they proceed?
Our embassy in Washington was alerted by US officials, and they made contact with us, and then we were able to see the announcement through the media.
To
Minister-
Thomas's
There
question,
There was confusion in the last, when it was previously announced. The US was a bit confused about the tariff rate that New Zealand charged. There was a confusion about 20%. Did we clarify that? And are there any other points that they are not quite clear on that we need to work through?
It has been clarified, but I don't think that today's announcement is about a tariff rate. I think it's the countries who the US has a trade deficit with.
Minister, Australia's got quite similar export industries to New Zealand in dairy and beef. Would that be a concern for New Zealand businesses, the fact that now they have to compete with Australia, which is cheaper?
Well, we've always competed with Australia,
But not
and
with this 5%
we've
tariff
always competed with Australia, and we continue to do in many countries of the world. And so I back New Zealand exporters because they're very efficient producers. But I want to be clear: tariff rates are not good for trade. They are, inflationary in the case of US consumers, and it does make it harder for New Zealand exporters to compete. But New Zealand exporters compete around the world, in the UK, in the European Union, and in China, and everywhere else with all other countries, including Australia. We do extremely well in that area.
Yesterday, the government celebrated the opening of an FBI office in Wellington. Today, we get more tariffs. What does this mean for the US-New Zealand relationship?
Well, I don't think it was celebrated yesterday. I think there was an announcement and it was discussed. But ultimately, though, we still have a very strong relationship with the US. I think what we've seen most recently with Canada is that countries you get on with and have a close relationship, you can have disagreements, including in trade. And it's just important that we cautiously and carefully work through that. Very clearly, what exporters have been saying to me over the last months and as early as today when I was in the Waikato is they don't want us to overreact. They want us to work constructively with the US to remove this additional tariff, and we'll be doing that.
Have you had any economic growth?
Look, the advice I've had from the Treasury is that while obviously this will have a negative impact on some individual exporters, it does need to be seen in the context of a much broader export industry with tens of billions of goods being exported every year. The potential impact to returns at the extreme end is about 0.6%. To put that in context, export returns can typically fluctuate by 8% in a year. So this is small in the overall proportion of the exporting that New Zealand does. I'm also advised that at the margin, it would have a downward impact for inflation and interest rates. Obviously, it's not good for the world economy. As we've said previously, the world does better when trade flows freely, but to some extent, global markets have already priced in this tariff war. So today's developments don't have a particularly negative impact, aside from that which we'd already been anticipating and which you've already seen reflected in low levels of business confidence.
What's the numerical number of that 0.6 in terms of a dollar figure?
Let me take you through that. So the way that works is that if you take overall trade with the US at about $10 billion, and then you say, well, at the margin you're adding 5%, that's $500 million, then that amounts to, in our overall return, around 0.6%.
Do you intend to impose any reciprocal tariffs?
Well, at this stage, our intention is to represent New Zealand's best case, and it is not clear to us at this point that approach would get a better deal for our exporters.
So you're ruling out any kind of response?
Well, no. It's, as I said by the media earlier, it's not something I'm going to be drawn on because the focus at the moment is to continue to engage with the US and make the case. If you think about, as I mentioned earlier, the trade surplus or deficit has swung quite significantly. It's not that many years ago that actually the US had a significant trade surplus in their favour against us. And there are New Zealand companies, including in New Zealand, that are looking to buy planes and things like that in the very near future. I can see a time, and not too far away, where actually we have a larger trade deficit with the US, and that will be very much the case that we will be making to them. So very clearly, exporters have said to us that what they want us to do is work through this, and we'll be putting all our efforts into ensuring that we can have the tariff rate reduced.
You talked up a big game, Minister. You've talked up a big game about the engagement with the US, citing your trips over. We know Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters went over. Do you feel like you've failed in the sense that you haven't convinced the US to back off and leave New Zealand alone in this respect?
Well, no, we haven't talked up our efforts. We've been talking about our efforts, and I've had 3 engagements with my counterparts. Minister Peter's been there, and there's been a lot of contact. There's a lot of countries in the world doing the same thing. I mean, interestingly, it's not that long ago we was holding conversations with Switzerland, who have virtually set up office there, and I noticed that they've got a 39% tariff against them. Ultimately, the US has said that they have a high tariff regime and a different approach to trade. In the case of other countries like us, they also face tariff rates. So we'll continue to engage, as we do with all countries, and ultimately put the effort in that the New Zealand exporters expect us to.
Are you considering taking WTO action or any sort of similar effort?
No consideration of that at this time.
And have you thought about bringing any investments forward in order to reduce that deficit, like the Boeing 757s, or asking in New Zealand, hey, do you need those planes sooner?
Well, ultimately, one of the things we will continue to do, but with more detail now, is talk about some of the investments or the purchases that are likely to happen. But ultimately, if you think about it, with a 0.8% average tariff rate against US goods, other countries, the European Union, who have much, much higher tariff rates, the ability to negotiate on tariffs is relatively small for New Zealand. But those are all conversations, yes, I'll be having with the US.
Stand to lose more if we negotiated than if we didn't?
Well, ultimately, that's not clear. Japan and Korea have negotiated in some degree. The media has said reached agreement, and they face the same treatment as us. So that's not clear that would have been the
Those
case.
concessions that New Zealand may have had to make.
Well, again, from a tariff point of view, if we have 0.8% tariffs, on average, placed against US goods, then that's not a significant amount. But I think the announcement we've seen from the White House is not about tariff rates; it's about a trade imbalance.
In the context of other countries, is New Zealand still in a relatively good place? There's only very few countries that got the 10%, so this is the second best case scenario, right?
Well, I don't think escalating tariff rates are our best case scenario at all. There are, you're right though, other countries that we compete against who face much higher tariff rates. Ultimately, that's to be worked through. But New Zealand's very clear. Exporters have options around the world. We've seen an additional $1 billion worth of exports go into the European Union, including exports in our direction increasing also as a result of the free trade agreement that's been in force for 12 months. Exporters tell me many of them are choosing that market because they will get better returns. The exporters themselves will work through some of that, but the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and NZTE are going to be working closely so that we can fully understand the implications and support them as conversations with the US goes on.
If you had an indication that the US was going to move in this direction, a few weeks, etc., earlier, why are you only talking about wanting to negotiate a deal now, and why didn't you act earlier in that process?
Well, no, I'm not sure that's what I said, or if I did, that's not what I meant. What I meant is there have been signals through the media, as President Trump has said for a period of time, he's looking to escalate tariffs on a number of countries. He often said that about particularly countries there. So what I have said is, it's not surprising that this has happened, although you should rest assured that there has been ongoing engagement with the US administration on the part of New Zealand.
And I think, to be clear, we have put our position forward to the US in no uncertain terms, that ours is a complementary trade relationship, that we charge them very low tariffs, that we have a long history of friendship, and all of those factors were on the table.
You said before that when he initially implemented them, that these weren't the actions of a friend. Do you still stand by that statement?
Sorry, when did I make that statement?
That was Australia that said that, not New Zealand.
My apologies.
That's all right. The flag's similar to.
I thought I would have remembered saying it.
Winter effects here in Wellington is laying off 100 staff. Is that bad for the city and the region's economy?
Oh, look, obviously I always feel for people going through a change process, and those who are being consulted on potential loss of jobs will be feeling that very directly, so I empathise with them. The government, for our part, has made our strong commitment to the screen sector very clear with our multi-million-dollar investment in it in this year's budget. That was intended to provide confidence that we will continue to have a generous rebate scheme in operation in New Zealand over the coming years. And while globally screen production and film production is in a bit of a lull, we know that New Zealand continues to be an attractive place to make films, not just because of the rebate regime, but because we've got great talent, great capability, great locations.
You don't see this as being outgunned by Australia?
No, I don't. I think that this is symptomatic of a slowdown globally in that industry.
What certainty can you provide for Kiwi businesses that may be worried hearing today's news?
Well, the first thing I would say is that we have the best exporters in the world. People buy our products because they are high quality, they are safe, they're efficiently produced, and that will continue to be the case. We have more than 70% of our exports covered by free trade agreements around the world, so we have choices, and our exporters have choices. Our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our New Zealand Trade and Enterprise will make themselves fully available to provide exporters information about their options and where they can sell their products. Ultimately, the world is going to want to keep buying New Zealand's products and services because we produce great stuff. And I know that this is unwelcome news today, of course it is, but I back our exporters to find ways through it and to continue to thrive.
Do you think commentary of the negative impact of this move has been a little bit sensationalised in the context of everything else that's going on?
Well, look, I can understand that as a free trading country, of course, any step backwards on that globally is something we won't welcome. And I can also understand that for some individual exporters, this is really bad news. But I do think we need to put it in perspective, which is that the US is only a small portion of our overall trade with the world, and that the exporters who export there are still producing great goods that are in demand globally. And we have to remember that over the past year, our exports grew phenomenally, both in volume and value. Why? Because the world wants what we make and what we sell, and I have every reason to believe that will continue to be the case. So while this is not a great development, of course it's disappointing. We shouldn't over-egg it. We shouldn't all go and batten down the hatches. We should remain confident that New Zealand has great growth prospects.
Economic growth is hard to find at the moment. This is unwelcome news. Is this going to loom over your party conference this weekend?
No, our party conference is going to be very much focused on how we are rebuilding this economy and the other steps that we are taking to make this an easier, better place to do business, to hire people, to create well-paying jobs. And it is our job as a government not to moan about the things we can't control, but to focus on how we can make things better here in New Zealand, and we're very proud of the efforts we're making.